Hello and welcome to this edition of Group Talk, the X series, using social controls in XPages. You'll be hearing from hosts from IBM, GBS, and TLCC. Without further ado, I'll pass it off to Howard Greenberg of TLCC.
Welcome, everybody. So before we get started, a couple things to go over. First of all, this is a monthly series that GBS and TLCC do, and a couple upcoming webinars are up on the screen now. In June, we have Stefan Wissel, who's from IBM, and he's going to be doing a presentation from Lotus here that he does where he talks about JavaScript, not only in the XPages context, but also how it can be used more as of the language itself, and some interesting things about JavaScript, which is good for not only beginners in JavaScript, but also for those who have been doing it for a while, because he does get into some more advanced things in working with JavaScript. And then in July, we have a panel of 4 experts. They are each going to do about a 5-minute presentation, and then the rest of the webinar is basically Q&A. So over the next 2-3 months, as you work with XPages and you got questions, jot them down and bring your questions to this webinar. And that's basically going to be, all about your questions, and we're going to try to, talk about whatever, is on your mind. And then in August, we have this one, is for the admins. We have a great presentation on what is the effect on the Domino server? How do you deploy XPages? What's the best way to deploy them and to manage them? And some of the settings you can do on your server to get the best performance. So that should be a great webinar too in August. Just a couple words about TLCC. We've been providing Notes in Domino training since 1997, and we started doing XPages courses back before 8.5.0 came out. In the beta of 8.5.0 is when we first started working on our courses. And right now we have 4 courses ranging from a JavaScript course that's a prerequisite for the other 2 core XPages courses, the Developing XPages course and the XPages 2 course. And then we have a specialized course on using the mobile controls and creating mobile XPages. Our courses are self-paced, so you can take them whenever, wherever you want, but we also have the ability to ask questions of our instructors in a course discussions database. And we also have just started instructor office hours, where once a week you can dial into a webinar and ask questions about the content in the courses, and we can share your screen or we can share our screen and work with you in a small group setting. We limit that to about 12 people. And we also can do private courses with you either online or at your site. Right now, we first of all, for any webinar participant, we do have a special URL where you can get 20% off on any TLCC course or 5% on any course on sale. And speaking of sales, we do have a spring sale going on right now that we just started the other day, where you can get some really good savings. So if you're ready to dive into XPages, now's a great time. We got some great savings for you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Della Nebbia, who's going to introduce our speakers.
Good day, everyone. We've got I've got an easy job today. I'm introducing folks that you know. Big part of the XPages technology that we know and love. We're going to have Martin Donnelly and Tony McGuckin from IBM Ireland speaking today. Dan O'Connor, who works out of Littleton, Massachusetts, and Nicholas Hedloff from IBM Germany. And you know these folks. You've written their books, or sorry, you've read their books. You've also probably read some of their blogs, and certainly seen them at presentations at Lotusphere and at the various lugs as well. By the way, that's Howard's photo top left and myself top right, and I'm going to introduce each of our speakers as we go through. But just before we do, just to expand on what Howard said about the question and answer. We'll have the question and answer at the end, but while the various speakers are doing their presentations, if you have a question for a specific speaker, just indicate that. You know, this is for Martin, for Dan, for Tony, for Nicholas. And then at the end of the session, when we get into the Q&A, Howard and myself will relay, we'll provide a voice for you to relay your questions to the appropriate speaker. Okay, so first off, we're going to have Martin Donnelly from IBM Ireland. He works out of Cork in Ireland. He's the XPages architect and the team lead for the XPages runtime environment. You may have read his books, excellent resources, Mastering XPages and the XPages, the more recent XPages Portable Command Guide. And not going to lie to you, these are not on my bookshelf because they're always on my desk. So if you don't have these books, I would highly recommend them. You can follow Martin at Tweeter Donnelly. He's one of the major contributors, and his team are major contributors of the Extension Library project at OpenNTF. And Martin's going to kick us off with an overview of the XPages social capabilities that are evolving at OpenNTF in the Extension Library and you know, soon to be brought into the product. Martin? Martin, we're not hearing you. Are you muted?
Hello.
Okay, there. We've got you now. And we've lost you.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you now, Martin.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure how much of you've heard and how much of my words you didn't hear, but in any case,
we're just hearing you now.
Okay, for the first time? Good.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so Paul, thank you very much for your very flattering introduction. I'll take all the kudos I can get. Since this is a social presentation, we thought we'd bring as many presenters as we can. So we have myself and Tony and Dan and Nicholas. All of us, of course, even though we're in different locations, hail from Europe. So I would suggest that you adjust your headsets accordingly, apply any filters that you need, and install the appropriate decoders to make sure we don't speak too fast or in terms unfamiliar to you. But good afternoon. Delighted to be here and to present. So as usual in these things, we have to, I don't intend to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but at the same time I can't just simply skip over it. The important point here, of course, is that everything you see today...
Martin, just going to interrupt you there.
Sure.
We're not seeing your slides. I think you need to share your screen there.
Okay, I did share out.
Yeah, now one way to do that is, you know, we're seeing it now.
And can you see all of my screen?
Yeah.
And just the slides, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so. Okay, possibly pushed the wrong button in attempting to unmute myself, so I'm sorry for the jumpy start here. I will go back to the previous slide if I can. Okay, so just a simple disclaimer, I guess, in terms of what you're seeing today and what you will see later on in terms of the demos will be open source software from OpenNTF by and large. So it's important to note that this is provided as is and without warranty. It is not officially part of the IBM offerings as yet, but as you will know and as I will talk about a little later on, there is a process for taking that open source software from OpenNTF and making it part of the XPages offerings in the future, and that's something that we'll touch on briefly. So today's agenda is broken up here. I'll take the first topic of social business and what all that is about, just provide some of the conceptual overview, talk about social business, what that means and what XPages is doing in this space. So I'll swiftly hand over to Tony McGuckin at that point, who will demonstrate a sample application we have to demonstrate and make clear XPages capabilities in that area, how the XPages work and how you yourself can build them, edit them, and have a bit of fun with them. From there we'll go to Dan, who will demystify the architecture of XPages social capabilities, and you'll learn all sorts of cool stuff about OAuth and token stores and endpoints and all that. And then to Nicholas, Mr. OpenNTF, who would like to show you some of the offerings on opentf.org/snippets, some of the social offerings there that are built by the community. And then there are 4 sections, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So, social business. What's it all about? So organizations across most industries and geographies, today they're striving to create the next generation of software tools to promote efficiencies through improving communications and collaborations, and hope to drive better business results in that way. In simple terms, this is social business. For most businesses, the goals would be simple, and not necessarily new, but to work effectively across countries and time zones, to bring together expertise from multiple sites, to reduce travel costs, to resolve problems more quickly through collaboration, to improve staff retention. All of these are sort of listed, I guess, as goals that could be achieved through the use of social software and improved next generation social software in the future. If we look at the next slide, which is Web 3.0, the social wave, this is 2012. Let's see where we've arrived at. In the early 90s, you had the advent and growth of the World Wide Web itself. By the mid-90s, you had the Domino server serving up forms and views as HTML web pages, and you had the Domino classic web engine. By 2001, 10 years later, we had Web 2.0 at the advent of that, and a collection of technologies and standards and patterns which enabled rich internet applications, and suddenly the possibility of rich internet apps becoming ubiquitous for all was born. We had continued growth in this Web 2.0 space for much of the 90s, the migration of rich client applications to Web 2.0, and by the end of that decade we saw XPages come to the Domino platform to support Web 2.0. But in the last few years, progress is always onwards and upwards, and the advent and growth of social apps and social networks has been to the fore. And I'm just going to, like last year alone, a statistic that was produced from last year was to estimate that 10 billion minutes of social was spent online on social networks per month. That's 1 in every 4.5 minutes, and it's one of these startling statistics that is probably on the increase, in fact. So if you can look back 20 years to Web 1.0, if you like, and you can see that times have moved aggressively, such that we are now no longer concerned with so much with rich internet applications, but rich internet applications that are interactive, that are highly social, that are highly dynamic. And here, I guess the first point is that social is no longer just in these standalone applications, but is being moved into your core business. And we'll be looking at how you can add these social capabilities inside your application. So really, we're looking at how social transforms the business experience by enabling interactions through social networks, be that external social networks or online corporate networks, or a mixture of both, by moving beyond the firewall within your organization, and such things as enhancing situational awareness, analyzing social data. So really all of the use cases that I mentioned earlier, how they are supported through enhanced social capabilities and software. I'll go to the next slide now. So we look at kind of 4 integration points here. So from an app dev standpoint, there are 4 points here. At the most basic level, I guess, it's possible for you guys with XPages and with other software, of course, to connect to these social services. In XPages, we are doing that via REST services, and the applications are then capable of consuming this social data inside your application. So if you like, that's the first level of social integration in your applications. But beyond that, you can go to the second level, which is all about embedding social capabilities. So here we're not just talking about data, but we're talking really about integrating widgets like the business card. So you don't just get data, but you get behaviors, as in the behaviors behind that data. And on a third level, you can look at extracting data from socially enabled applications, such that if you have a very common use case which we all can probably relate to is some sort of collaborative social app where people are commenting on a particular topic. You can imagine that those comments are in fact being contributed to an activity stream, and in that activity stream not only are they available in a social manner there that it can be shared, but analytics can be run on that stream for sentiment analysis or whatever type of analysis is appropriate to the topic in question. So here that is the third level of extraction. And finally, I think that the point that we're looking at here is the notion of containers bringing a new center of gravity. You've probably heard of open social containers and standards like Shindig, etc. But really what we're talking about is the ability to host these gadgets within the application itself so that you're not taken away from your application when it comes to working with social content, that really the center of gravity is within your application in that sense. So what social services are we talking about? Well, the social service we're talking about here is really the IBM social platform, which has 4 major offerings as listed on this slide. You have IBM Connections, which has kind of formalized a lot of the social components that we talk about today, such as communities, profiles, and files. You have Lotus Domino with a 20-year history and more in the collaboration space, and data there, of course, has been gathered over a long, long time, and that is very useful to integrate and to share in applications. You have IBM Same Time, and of course you have SUT, Same Time Unified Telephony in that space, and you have offerings that can be made available in the cloud via Lotus Live. Of course, aside of the IBM social platform, you have external social networks like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth. And we're really looking in this talk about how XPages meets the challenge of sort of integrating not just all of the components in the IBM social platform, although that's obviously a key goal, but also bringing in, going beyond the firewall and bringing in the external social networks to based on a kind of common pattern and so forth. So I'll go to my next and my slide, and we'll talk about the social enabler. So really the social enabler is the demo application for doing what I've just described, i.e. getting at the components of the IBM social platform and the external network components. It's made available on OpenNTF, and so it's your entry point into all of this. The next speaker, Tony, will give you an in-depth walkthrough of this. I'll just kind of take one final minute and talk about the model that's here. Since September 2010, there's been OpenNTF has had the extension library up there as a project, and if we fast forward to last December, where we shipped something called the upgrade pack for Domino 853, what we succeeded in doing was taking a bunch of open source components that started out life in September 2010 and integrating them into 853 after it shipped via this upgrade pack. So there's clearly a migration pack there, a migration path there for components to make their way from open source, where you can basically play with them, you can evaluate them, you can extend them, and you can give your input on them, and so on. And you know, after components like this that eventually migrate into the core of the project itself, you can therefore have great influence over what form and shape these components take. So at this point, what I'd like to do is actually hand over to Tony and let him demonstrate the social enabler application that's available from OpenNTF today. And
okay.
Tony, good luck with that.
Actually, I'll do a brief introduction of Tony. Tony McGuckin is a senior software engineer at the IBM, with IBM Ireland, actually works out of Cork, Ireland. He's part of the XPages core runtime group, also the author of the Mastering XPages and XPages Portable Command Guide, and a big contributor at the at OpenNTF with the XPages Extension Library project and other projects as well. And as Martin said, Tony's going to give us an overview of the social controls and data sources that are available for XPages. Tony?
Okay, thank you, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Okay.
And we're hearing you and seeing your screen right now, Tony. That's great.
Okay, so just taking off here from slide 10. Thanks, Martin, for leading up to this. But what I'm going to do here just over the course of the next several slides, and with some degree of demonstration as well, is speak about the social enabler application. So it's an application that we've put together to try and make it as easy as possible for you, our end users, to pick it up and learn from what we have done here in terms of using a new set of social controls, social data sources, to try and make it, like I say, for you as easy as possible to integrate social aspects into your applications. So really what we do have here is a new set of Java assets which are now part of the extension library in the OpenNTF extension library. For the best part of it, they do provide a number of different data sources which can be used for REST services. Now when I speak about the data sources in this manner, we are talking about having these data sources embedded within the runtime itself, so that the server acts as the proxy for the REST service requests. We will describe that in more detail as we move through today's presentation. We also have a set of extended renderers, in that you can have such things as a computed field, but you can set a specific renderer type on that computed field to do certain things, such as integrate with same time, or such things as bringing in profile cards and so on. You will see worked examples of that within the presentation. We also then have a number of controls which wrap, they are XPages controls, which wrap around existing Dojo controls and so on to provide richer visualizations for your social controls. And as I did mention there, as I did allude to, there is that core services layer built into the runtime itself, which acts as the proxy and also integrates with the credential store. And again, these are some things that I believe Dan will follow up with later in our presentation, particularly in around the likes of the credential store, OAuth, authentication, and so on. So the one key aspect about the social enabler is that it is a standalone application. It's a demonstration database that you can quite literally drop into your environment, and with a little bit of configuration with the credential store, you can certainly be up and going within a few minutes. Now there are a few premises to that, in that such things as Twitter, Dropbox connections and so on, that you would have accounts with those different services, in which then you can configure your social enabler to connect through the credential store and surface that data within the social enabler application. So what I will do here is just skim through the next several slides quite quickly, and then I'll step over and relate the data within the slides to the actual presentation demonstration of the social enabler application. So first off, here on slide 11, this slide just talks around the idea of having access to an underlying user data object. Within the runtime, we've introduced the concept of a user bean and a people bean, aka people data providers. So in this case, what you can do is make use of the user bean directly within your server-side JavaScript code, or indeed within any managed beans that you may provide yourself, or custom Java code. And this object gives you direct access to information about the currently logged in user, or indeed any given user that you may request information on. Now the interesting thing is that you can extend this object. You can provide different data providers, in that you can extend the pool of information that this object can extract from. So for example, your user bean may pull in data from a relational database. You may also then specify a data provider which pulls information from such things as an LDAP directory or connections or same time or whatever. So in that case, your user bean implicitly will seek information on that user and provide that through its interface. And we will take a look at a worked example of that in a few moments. Moving on then to number 12. There's also a layer then that provides connection services. So if we take IBM Connections, we have a set of data sources that provide atom rest type operations, and we also then do that using such things as XPath binding. If you are familiar with XPages, you will be already familiar with the notion of JavaScript bindings and EL, or expression language bindings. One thing that XPages has supported for quite a long time has been the notion of XPath bindings, but we do certainly make extensive use of that within the connections data sources and anywhere else, of course, that you would use such things as a REST or an ATOM data source. You can see just a very brief example there in the slide. It alludes to an example of such a binding. In this case, we are specifying the fact that we do have a data source, entry being the root of that, and we're pulling out the title of a particular entry within that data source. And the key there to the expression is the XPath binding at the front. So that's all very interesting stuff in terms of working with connections and also any REST or ATOM-based data feeds. There's also a set of extended widgets for consuming such things as profile cards. So again, through connections, there is such things as the profiles business card, but also communities business cards. And again, within the set of controls that are provided with the social library, there are corresponding controls for dragging and dropping on your page and for setting the content type and so forth to integrate with these different types of business card. Okay, and moving on to 14. There's also then an extensive API for working with activity streams. Now, Martin described earlier some of the great benefits of working with such things as the open social container and so on. And again, here inside XPages, we do have a number of data sources which now allow you to participate within an activity stream, to read the data, but also to push data into an activity stream. And on slide 15, and just staying within IBM, within the IBM product suite, again, there's controls for working with same time. So taking the computed field analogy again, you can literally drag and drop a computed field onto your page and set the content type, as you can see here, and it will go off and pulling information about the same time awareness of any given person based on the fact that you have the application configured, of course. We'll take a look at a work example of that in an upcoming demonstration. So slide 16. There is a set of data sources again which support the notion of working with not only connections, Lotus Live, file sharing providers, but also Dropbox. And that same notion could be extended to any file sharing provider that you might consider. Currently we support, as it notes here, connections, Lotus Live and Dropbox. And we can take a look at perhaps we'll have time to take a look at sharing files and deleting them and so forth using these data sources. The other thing that are provided here with these data sources is the notion of being very smart in terms of being able to page through such file sharing providers. So if you can imagine looking at your Dropbox account, you can pretty much use a data view or a view panel or a simple data table or repeat control, of course, and in setting the data source to being one of these file sharing providers, you can of course then page through the underlying data store accordingly. Okay, and on slide 17, and then we'll take a brief look at slide 17, and then we'll step over to the application itself. So there are a number of other data sources built in as well for working with other external social networks. Not just connections here, we're stepping outside the realm of IBM to look at such things as Facebook and Twitter. So these data sources and I should say controls allow you to interact with Facebook and Twitter accordingly. And again, within the social enabler database, there are examples of that. And as I said to you at the start, on the premise that you do have the underlying credential store configured and connected with your social networks, your social enabler application will of course allow you to interact with these external data sources or social networks accordingly. So without further ado, what I will do here is minimize the slides, and I'll take a look here at Designer first off. So taking a look here at what I've got opened, I have a couple of applications opened, one of which is the social enabler database, as you can see here on the left side in the application navigator. On the right side, having the extension library from OpenNTF installed, you can see a number of different control categories. And as you can see here, there is a social business toolkit entry where we have a number of different connections and same time controls, but also interspersed throughout the control categories, you will find other examples of REST services, Facebook controls, and so on. And the other place where some of this stuff turns up, if I were to, let me just go to a different custom control. If I were to, for example, look at the data panel here for this particular custom control, if I then click on the Add Data Source, here you can see an extended set, not only Domino Document, Domino View, but we also have a number of other types of data source, as you can see here. All kind of relating back to what we looked at on the slides, activity streams, connections, file store data sources, and so on. And of course I do also have the relational plugins installed here as well, hence we see such things as the JDBC data sources. So let's take a look then at some of the stuff we described in the slides. First off, the user bin. Within a different application here, I wanted to use this particular example to demonstrate use of the user bin. It is quite succinct and gets the point across very well. So taking this XPage test user bin, here you can see there is a table that contains a number of labels and computed fields. If I take a look at the underlying markup, here you can see in the bindings for each of the controls, so taking the image, for example, here on line 8, we have the URL calling out an EL expression, as you can see here. It's making direct use of user bin, so it's referencing this inbuilt user bin object. You as an end user, as a developer, do not have to go off and instantiate that object. It is already instantiated for you implicitly within the runtime, of course through the extension library. You will not find this object within a standard application that is not using the extension library. So given that, here we can see the reference is then making use of a property exposed on that object, thumbnail URL. So all very simple at that level. We then move down through. Here we can see another example, getting the email. Now in this case we're making use of the people bean. So user bean being singular, people bean being something that is wider. It contains a collection of people objects, each one representing information about any given person. That information being drawn in from some of the external data providers. But in this case we're interrogating the people bean. We're saying, okay, please give me the email for this specified person. In a roundabout way we could have just said userbean.email, but it just gives you a insight into the connection between the two. The user bean, of course, is already stacked within the people bean object. So in this case we're just dereferencing the same object. Like I say, we could have just said userbean.email. And we can just move down through the example. You can see multiples of computed fields, and again just using that same dereference pattern, userbean.display name and so on. Now that goes further in that you can also pull in other things. Given that we are inside the Domino environment, we can pull in other things such as privileges for that particular user. So in this case userbean can create docs and so on, as you can see here. Okay. And you also have such things as the access levels, as you can see, and the access roles. So userbean access roles to string, as you can see here, will give you back an array in string format of any roles that user may be in. So this object saves you a lot of working with the session object to create names and all that sort of stuff. You've got it all directly provided to you through the userbean, as you can see here in the markup. Stepping over to the browser, let me just find that particular worked example. So here in this case, what I'm doing is finding the test userbean XPage, as you can see here, the one that we just looked at within Designer. And given that I have just logged in as myself, the userbean has gone off and retrieved my image from the Blue Pages, the IBM Blue Pages directory. It has found my email address and so on, as you can see here. It has found also other things pertinent to my Domino account, such as canonical name and so on, and then my access privileges to this current database. Okay, and just going back to Designer, I did say that you could extend this object to pull in information from other data providers. Now here you can see in the XSP properties file for this application, just here on line 1, there's a special property here whereby I am specifying different providers. So this userbean will interrogate these different providers. So in this case we have Profiles, Blue Pages, Lotus Live, and so on. So if you have your data providers configured within the runtime, then of course the userbean will use those libraries to try and resolve information about that current user. And again, it is on a sequential basis. If I try and retrieve information about user X, it will search the providers sequentially and return information from the first found instance within those providers. Okay, so moving on then, let me just go back to my browser. I'm now looking at the social enabler application. Like I say, you can pull this out of the extension library resources, drop it into your environment, and configure your security store, your credential store accordingly so that the application will work with the external providers and so on. But pretty much what you can see here are a number of tabs alluding to the different types of data store that will be retrieved and so on. So for example, if I click on IBM Connections, at the moment here I'm logged in as myself. It recognizes that I'm authenticated as myself, and then using some of the data sources and so on provided, I can then consume information from Connections about me. So in this case, there is a server-side JavaScript call which causes the runtime to retrieve a atom feed about me from Connections. And again, this follows through for such things as communities and so on, as you can see here. Clicking on the Communities tab, here we have a data view, the very well liked data view that we find in the extension library, plugged up with a data source which is pointing at Connections, in particular the Communities store. And from that it provides us then with a data set which we can page through, and of course we can expand and collapse entries. And just as a little aid there, within some of the entries you can see that we can expand the content and look at the underlying XML feed that comes back, as you can see here, just to give you some appreciation of what's happening. So like I say, underneath the hood, here we have an example of the runtime using a control, a drag and drop control on the server side, and acting as the proxy back to the external data source. So none of this REST-based data provision is happening on the client side. It's all happening within your Domino server, so it's highly secure and performant. Moving on, activities. I don't believe I have any activities created, hence the data set is empty. I did mention the notion of the profiles and communities cards. And again, here we have examples. What we're looking at here is the next page with a computed field. The content type has been set to the appropriate content type, and because we're now connected and our endpoint has been connected with the external provider, in this case Connections, the content type then resolves the computed field information. In this case, my name is used as an ID, and we can then expose such things as you can see here, the pop-up vCard, all through the use of the content type and a computed field. And again, the same notion applies to, I've just clicked a little bit quickly there, causing an AJAX request to fail, but here we can see the communities vCard as well. Again, taking a view panel, in this case a one-column view panel, if I were to click on one of the column entries, you can see that on the right side there's a dynamic retrieval of the communities vCard, and again that's using the content type set accordingly. Okay. And then finally, within this connection space, taking a look at files. So in this case, I have a couple of files already uploaded. And again, if I click on one of the files, here you can see that the image is downloaded. But the very interesting thing about this is the URL. Note the format of the URL. We are using the social enabler database. So here you can see XPages spt.nsf, but note the other parts of the URL. We're calling on the XPages runtime xsp/.proxy, and so on. So again, a great example of how the runtime is used as the proxy, in this case, to serve the content. Okay, and on the same token, if I were to take another one and upload, I can say OK. That wasn't meant to happen. So what I will do there is I think I'll move on to another example. My system may have become a little bit unstable. Moving on to the same time example. Here I've clicked on the IBM Same Time tab, and in doing so the page started to render itself. The controls started to process against the Same Time server to try and establish my Same Time awareness. And as you can see here, when I mouse over, it's pinning across my Same Time information. And again, these are computed fields with their content type set accordingly for the content type provider. So here you can see that Precious now appears. And of course, given that I have Dropbox installed on this machine, you can see the notification on the top right. If we take a look at that on the file system, of course you can see Precious appearing there. And again, just using the same format as before, as we've seen with the connections files, if I do try and navigate to that particular entry, again, my system has become very unstable, as you can see. That particular entry does again use the underlying proxy ability of the runtime to display the image. And there are other controls then for working with Facebook. As you can see here, you can make comments and so on. And if I move then on to Twitter as well. Using Twitter, you have a data source which allows you to look at your Twitter account using different formats. As you can see here, your timeline, your mentions, and so forth. But you can also search against the Twitter data source as well. So in this case, this particular example is hard-coded to search for XPages. So as you can see here, we do have a recent entry coming in here from GBS Knows and so forth. Do feel free to fire off one there at the moment, and we could refresh, and you could see that happening live within this example. And again, just let me go back to Designer. So taking an example for that Twitter one, here we have the data view as mentioned, and within the data view there's a number of different computed fields have been used accordingly. So for the inside the summary title we have the summary title itself, but there's a abstract area providing a link, a computed field, and so on. We have some links for retweeting, replying, and so on. But just taking a look at the XSP markup, we can see that we have the data view. The data view exposes a variable called tweet, and then the data source has been set accordingly. So the data view has a Twitter data source. Its endpoint is set up as Twitter, and the hashtag in this case is hard-coded, like I say, for XPages. That of course could be computed or it could be brought in from the query string parameters. So you can drive it dynamically, but you can see such things as how we access the tweet information then. So the view summary column is just simply dereferencing the tweet variable to get the author link. And again, such things as the images, the avatars that we see appearing on the left side, accessed using tweet.image, as you can see here, and so on. So all very simple to use. In terms of the endpoint that we mentioned, that again is something that I think Dan will cover, but pretty much the it's available as well. So within your server-side JavaScript, you can call such things as @endpoint, get URL, and so forth, current user. And there's also this notion of navigators, utilities which allow you to navigate and traverse Atom feeds or JSON feeds. So taking one example, if we take this XML data navigator, if I were to use one of the predefined XPath queries, here you can see that I can consume the first name entries for all of the entries. In this case there are 2 entries, and I'm getting John and Robert as a return set. Here's John, here's Robert, and so on. So it makes it very easy to work with add-on fields and so on through the use of your data sources in server-side JavaScript. And on the same token, that exists for the JSON data set as well. So in this case, person's person age, and again it consumes John and Robert's ages, as you can see here, age 54 and 43 accordingly. Okay, so I believe at this point I have covered everything that I could cover. There's a lot more in there. It's a great example that I really do encourage you to go off and take down and configure and study how the application is working underneath. And I think I will hand over now, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And give me a moment. On my screen now, our next speaker is Dan O'Connor. You know Dan as the team lead for Lotus Domino Designer. He's working now out of Littleton, Massachusetts, but of course when he begins to speak you might get a hint of his Irish heritage as well. You can follow Dan at DoConnor78, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, but Dan, it's hard to believe that 77 people got to that handle before you did. Dan is also a co-author of the XPages Portable Command Guide, along with Tony and Martin, and also a contributor to the extension library project at OpenNTF, specifically the XPages social enabler controls, and that's Dan's topic. So Dan, over to you.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Paul. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can hear you well and see your screen.
Okay, great. So I'll start presenting. So Tony gave a very comprehensive overview there of what's available in the social enabler. So I'm sure you'll all agree that we have shown some pretty interesting functionality. The next obvious question probably that many of you are asking if you're application developers is how does this work and how exactly can, excuse me, how can I get this into my XPages application? So the XPages social enabler, it basically comprises of 3 primary components. We have the social enabler plugin, which is a runtime plugin installed on your server. We have the web security store, which is just a notes database. And then we have the XPages social enabler demo application, which Tony went through from start to finish. So these 3 components, they're currently shipped as a part of the extension library, and they're available on OpenNTF and have been since late last year. The social enabler plugin, it contains REST data source definitions such as the connections data source that Tony showed. We also have the file data source that was showed as well, that allows you to view your files and upload files. There are also social network data sources such as the Twitter data source, and then of course there are social controls like the Facebook comment control and so on. But the most important part probably of this is that there are a bunch of APIs available within the social enabler plugin that allow you to directly invoke REST services from within your XPages application. So if for some reason there is a REST service that is not consumed by the social enabler, then you can just directly invoke REST services from within your XPages application. Then next we have the web security store, which is basically just a container application, and it's a container for your OAuth key and secret and your OAuth URL information. And if you're using basic authentication, which some websites do, then the web security store is actually used to store the user's credentials if they choose to save their credentials. Of course, as we say here, do not try this at home. We strongly advise against trying to create your own token store. We've seen instances where people do create their own token store, but it is to be avoided, as it is easy just to store tokens, but to store them securely is not a trivial task. So we encourage people just to use the web security store that is shipped as a part of the extension library. The XPages social enabler in itself, the sample application, is what you just saw. It's basically, as the name suggests, it is just a sample application to show how to use and how to consume all of these various data sources and controls. If you, as an application developer, want to integrate some of these controls into your own application, then all you need is the plugin and the web security store, and you are by all means welcome to copy code from the sample application into your own application. So I'm just going to give a quick overview here of the life cycle of a typical request, just to show what happens when a user requests, for instance, to see the Twitter page that Tony showed, what happens behind the scenes. So the user would come in and make a request to the Twitter tab, would click on the Twitter tab within the Social Enabler demo application. At that point, the Social Enabler demo application obviously falls back to the Social Enabler plugin, which makes a request. The first request will be made will be to the security store to see if there's a token stored within the security store for this particular user that is logged in. So if it's the first time that the user has tried to access Twitter, null will be returned, no token will be returned, and at that point the OAuth authentication will kick in, and the user's information, the OAuth information will be looked up in the web security store. A request will be made to Twitter to log in the user will be logged in, and then at that point the social enabler sends a REST API call to Twitter with some information. Twitter will then process that information, that request, and will send a response, and the response will be received by the Social Enabler plugin. The Social Enabler plugin will then parse all of the information that is responded with. Typically this information is going to be either in JSON or XML format, and that response will then be encapsulated into objects which the XPages runtime can understand, such as raw data objects, which are going to appear in a view, and those objects are then passed back to the XPages runtime and displayed within your XPage application, or in our case the Social Enabler demo application. So as alluded to already, so the Social Enabler supports different types of authentication. We have OAuth authentication, which is probably the most popular form of authentication used by social networks. We also have basic authentication, which is used by IBM Connections, and this type of authentication is basically just where a user gets prompted by the XPages application itself for their username and password. That username and password are then stored in the security store if the user chooses to save that information, and the username and password is then passed by the social enabler to the online service, and the login happens. Of course, anonymous authentication is also supported, and this whole authentication mechanism in place, it's sufficiently flexible that in the future we will easily be able to extend it to support different techniques for authenticating, such as SAML, and I believe there's already plans in the works to provide LTP8 authentication. So the authentication is actually configured at the endpoint level, which is just a managed bean, which I will get to in the coming slides. And then within the XPages Social Enabler demo application, we have provided a sample login page that is written in XPages that just shows you how you would configure basic authentication if the service you're trying to connect to only supported basic authentication. And then, as I already stated, all of your OAuth information, so if you're familiar with OAuth, you are provided with several different URLs and a key and a secret. All of this information is stored within your web security store application. So you've heard me talk about OAuth. Not everyone is probably aware of what it is. So OAuth is basically a protocol that allows secure authentication in a simple method from desktop and from browser applications. It is used widely by social networks and online services. OAuth 2.0 is the latest version that is available, and currently the social enabler only supports OAuth 1.0, but there are plans to upgrade this over time. Of course, OAuth is used by all of the major social networks. It's used by Facebook and Twitter, Lotus Live, LinkedIn, etc. So the XPages Social Enabler, it acts as an OAuth consumer in that the OAuth provider, which is Facebook or Twitter or whatever social service you're trying to connect to, that service will provide you with some information which the social enabler then consumes and uses in order to be able to connect to that online service. So this screenshot just basically shows how you would configure your OAuth information within the web security store. So you have to enter in the application ID and service name, which are defined within your application through an endpoint, which I will get to in the next slides. And then all of the rest of the information here, the consumer key, the key type, which is basically the encryption for the key, the consumer secret, the request URI, the authorization URI, and the token URI, all of this information is provided to you by the online service. So for instance, Twitter or Dropbox would have information that would provide you with all of this information that you would then enter into your web security store, so that when the XPages Social Enabler demo application or your own application tries to connect to one of these services, it is the information stored within the security store that is used to make that connection. So I've been talking about endpoints. So as you can imagine, describing configuration information about all of these different online services, it could become very complicated very quickly unless we define some uniform way of actually describing what we're trying to do. So this is where the notion of an endpoint comes into play. So the Social Enabler plugin, it provides a simple to use mechanism for encapsulating services, and this mechanism is what we call an endpoint. There are different types of endpoints that are available, and each endpoint type has its own parameters. The type of endpoint used to connect to a particular service actually determines the type of authentication that will be used when connecting to that service. So for instance, we have an OAuth endpoint which requires an app ID, a service name, both of which we were talking about earlier, and also the token store information. Then there's a basic endpoint and anonymous endpoints and so on. So the endpoints, basically I'm showing an endpoint here, and an endpoint is basically defined as a managed bean. So any of you familiar with managed beans will immediately see some similarities here. So endpoints are just like managed beans, are defined within the Faces config file that resides within your application. In this particular example that I'm showing here, I'm showing the Dropbox endpoint. And so the first thing you'll notice that is defined is the bean name, which we refer to as the endpoint name, so it's just called Dropbox. The next thing that is defined is the managed bean class. In this case, it's a Java class, and this is what we refer to as the endpoint class. We define the scope. Then the next thing, we have to define several properties that are required. We define the URL property, which is just the URL to the service which we were trying to connect to. In this case, we're trying to connect to Dropbox, so we have a URL for Dropbox. And then we have a service name and an app ID. And both of these, I'll just skip back to this slide, both of these are what is defined as app ID and service name within our web security store. So these labels, these identifiers have to be identical to what is defined within our endpoint. So at runtime, when the Social Enabler tries to connect to Dropbox, it will do a lookup within the web security store, and it will look up based on a service name of Dropbox and an app ID of XPages SBT. And then once that lookup is completed, the OAuth information then will be retrieved, and it will be up to the endpoint class to do all of the various connections with OAuth in order to do authentication and retrieval of your data. So this is basically touching on something that Tony has already shown, just showing that we've added some new functions. So we have an @endpoint function, and this call up here at the top of the page, basically we're making a call to retrieve our Dropbox endpoint. And if I just skip back, you'll see that we have our Dropbox endpoint defined here. Skipping forward again, so what this call does is basically it gets this Dropbox class which has been defined, and it calls the authenticate method with a parameter of true, and this is called on page load. So before the page loads, the SBT, the social enabler, allows us to authenticate with Dropbox, and login will happen at that point if the user has not already been prompted to log in. Then next we have a Dropbox file service, file data source. So basically this data source is defined at the page level, and basically what this data source does is it retrieves information from Dropbox for us, just like if we had a Domino data source. When the page is loading, the Domino data source would retrieve our Domino documents or our view information. In this case, this data source retrieves our documents, our files from Dropbox, metadata about our files, and all of that metadata then is displayed within this view panel control, which is bound to our file service data source. So I'll just give a quick demo of how authentication happens and how I would configure my application to run Twitter, for instance. So the first thing I'm going to do is I go to Twitter and I'm going to log in as DO'Connor78, and I'm logging into the developer site for Twitter, and it's just showing me all of my apps. So if I was starting from scratch, I would just click this button here to create a new app, and I would have to enter some information about my application. So on the Twitter site, I've already created an application, so I'm just going to click on that. And now if I go in, I can see there's some information in here that I'm going to need to configure my application within the social enabler. So I have a consumer key, a consumer secret. Both of these are provided to me by Twitter. And then there's a host of URLs here that are very important to enable us to perform the three-legged dance, as it is called, within OAuth. So these are my OAuth URLs that I referred to earlier. So I have a request, an authorize, and an access URL. I have a consumer key and a consumer secret, and then if I read the Twitter documentation, I will get information about the encryption type, which I also must set. So I'm going to actually log out of here, and I will go to my web security store application, and we can see that if I was starting from scratch, I would choose to add a new token, but in this case I've already created a Twitter token. So our XPages SBT is the app ID, Twitter is the service name. I've entered my consumer key, the encryption type. I enter my consumer secret, which I've gotten from Twitter, and then the three URLs, which I've just shown, which Twitter have also provided to me. So I've got all of this information. I've entered it into my web security store application. I save that. And I'm just going to check here just to make sure. Okay, so these are my user tokens, so once I log in, a token will be stored on my behalf so that I don't get prompted to log in on consecutive requests to the online service. So now if I go back to my demo application, and if I attempt to log into Twitter, we'll see what happens is the request is made in the background to the token store asking if there's a token for Dan O'Connor. No token is returned, so then this three-legged dance happens, which is this, the Twitter OAuth information is retrieved from the token store, and a request is made to Twitter given the key and the secret, and Twitter then recognizes this is the Think Friday application, and it prompts me asking, do you want to allow the Think Friday application to access your data on your behalf? So I'm going to say yes, I do, to authorize. And now I'm going to get redirected back to the Twitter data source, and I can see all of my various tweets, and then obviously just like Tony showed, we have all of the different information coming in directly from Twitter. So then just to show basic authentication, if I go to my files, I get prompted to log into connections, but you can see that this particular is an actual X page that's stored within the XPages SBT application. So this X page can be copied if you want to. It shows how to perform basic authentication, and if I choose to save here, my credentials would then get stored into the web security store. So I'm just going to log in, and then my information actually gets downloaded from Greenhouse. All of my files the metadata about my files gets downloaded from Greenhouse. So that's pretty much it for the demo. I'm just going to skip back to the presentation. So as Tony mentioned, the extension library also has a highly secure proxy service built in. So this proxy servlet is instantiated within the hosting application, so within the XPages SPT application or within your application if you're using the social enabler. And the proxy servlet will only serve requests from the application in which it is running by default. The servlet can be configured, of course, to serve requests from other apps, but that is not the default behavior. The proxy solves the classic cross-domain issue, which this diagram is trying to illustrate. So if you think of the case of the files data source, whereby we're showing information about your files that reside on Dropbox. In this case, we send a request to Dropbox, a REST API request to Dropbox, and Dropbox sends back some information about each file, such as the last time it was modified, its location within Dropbox, etc. But it'll also send a link that will allow us to download that file if we want to download it. But the problem is that that link is to www.dropbox.com. So if you clicked on that link, if we were just to add it to our XPages application, the link would actually redirect us out to Dropbox. So we would lose context. We would move out of the context of our NSF. So that is what this proxy solves, is that we modify that information so that the proxy actually takes care of downloading the file for us. So we never actually lose context. We never actually move out of the context of our NSF application. The file gets downloaded to our local machine without having to actually go out to Dropbox to download it. So that's the proxy. So we also have several extension APIs that Tony covered, so I can actually probably skip through them as we're getting a little short on time. But basically the social enabler, it provides us with extension points that allow us to contribute and provide user-related data. So Tony gave the example earlier of an application wanting to get some info about a particular user. So if you actually think about this, this could actually be a very difficult problem to solve, as there's lots of different ways to go out and get this information. But all of this is actually provided to you via an interface, so it's actually very uniform how we retrieve data about users. The extension point, it's highly optimized to support caching of data, and it's also secure. There are blocks in place that will prohibit you from seeing information that is sensitive to a particular user if you're not allowed to pass by those blocks. All of the contributed providers, they're switched off by default, except for some core Domino providers, which are shown here. And the providers are actually enabled via xsp.properties and are queried in the order in which they're encountered, which Tony got to. So basically, in this case, the profiles provider would be queried first for the information, and then the Lotus Live provider would be queried next. And there are four pre-canned providers that are currently supplied out of the box, which are shown here at the bottom of the screen. So in order to make developing applications, social applications, easier, we've also packaged a number of utilities into the social enabler. So we have 3 new app functions that make it very easy to get an endpoint instance from within your social enabler application. We've also created a couple of app functions that allow the developer to quickly get a user's identity from within your code. So if you think of the notion of identity, you might wonder what we're talking about here. So in the case of the Domino server, I'm logged into the Domino server as Dan O'Connor /Cambridge/IBM. But on Twitter, I'm DO'Connor78, and on Facebook, I have some other identity. So basically, that's what these app functions allow us to do. It allows us to associate a particular online identity with your Domino ID, so that when you're moving from one service to another, it's seamless. As far as the Domino server is concerned, you're always Dan O'Connor /Cambridge or whatever your user ID is. But as far as the social enabler is concerned, it's able to store your different identities and associate them with your Domino ID. We also have a bunch of client service helper classes. You can actually call these classes, these Java classes, from directly within your server-side JavaScript. So as I said earlier, if there's a particular REST API that has not been consumed by the social enabler, you can actually just consume it directly from within your server-side JavaScript. So in this case, we are calling the Twitter service to call some other REST API which is not currently consumed by the Twitter service, and basically in this case the REST API call will be made directly to Twitter, and the result will get returned here into your server-side JavaScript code. And then you can parse that information and handle it however you want from within your server-side JavaScript. And then finally we have the data navigators, which Tony showed. There's an example XPage within the Social Enabler application that shows how to use these. So these navigator utilities provide easy-to-use APIs for consuming both JSON and XML data. They utilize basically the notion of XPath, which some developers might be familiar with. It's very similar to XPath, but it actually performs much better. These utility classes basically eliminate the need for extensive null checking. So if you were to look at our XML document down here, if we wanted to get the name of Frank Adams from this, if we were to do it the standard way, we would have to get the status node, get the statuses node, check to make sure that's not null, then get the status node, check that's not null, and so on and so forth until we get down to the name node and then get Frank Adams' name from that. But with these utilities, we just basically create one of these data navigators and provide the path that we want to retrieve, and then from there all of the null checking is encapsulated within the navigator itself, so you never actually run into these null pointer exceptions that you might run into within regular parsing of this information. And of course this makes your code much more readable and much more robust. So that's it for me. I'll hand it back to Paul to introduce Nicholas.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And our next speaker, Nicholas Haidloff. Nicholas works out of, now I'm going to butcher this one, Bielefeld, Germany. Well, probably not as bad as what I did to D. O'Connor 78. But anyway, comes to us from Germany, Mr. Social, Mr. OpenNTF, Mr. XPages Info. I'm sure you've either seen him at a Lotus presentation or seen him out there in the social mediums. At OpenNTF, he's on the board of directors. He's the chair of the technical committee, and he maintains the XPages Info site. Back to OpenNTF, he contributes to well over 100 projects at OpenNTF, including the extension library, the social enabler, mobile controls project, the XSnippets project. It probably would be easier to describe which projects he's not contributing to. He's the author of the social enabler chapter in the new book, and this will be on my desk as well, the XPages extension library book, and we're hoping to see this next month time frame. So his topic is he's going to show us some of the social enabler applications that are available through XSnippets and available to you now at XSnippets, and also talk to how to, from your XPages, access things like IBM Connections and the IBM Social Business Toolkit. Okay, over to you, Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well, and I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Thanks for the nice introduction. Just one correction. I'm listed as the author of many OpenNTF projects, but for most of them, I'm actually only the IBM committer. So I work with my colleagues at IBM to commit these projects to OpenNTF, but my colleagues are actually the authors, the developers, for most of the projects anyway. I personally have worked on the mobile controls, on the extension library, social enabler, XPages for connections, just to name a couple of projects that I've done myself. So in my part, I want to now talk about a sample application called XSnippets that uses a lot of the functionality that you just saw. The application XSnippets is an application that is available on OpenNTF. both as a deployed version that you can use today to share code snippets, and it's also available as open source so that you can download it and copy and paste the code that you are interested in into your own applications. As I said, the application, the deployed version, is used for developers to share code snippets, but you can also just reuse certain controls or parts of that application in your own applications that are not targeted to developers, but for any other types of applications and targeted to other types of users. Now, what I need to mention here is that this is an application that has been built by the community and for the community. So there has been an effort from several people who are involved in OpenNTF: Serdash Pashmez, Bruce Elgott, Frank van der Linden, and I were the main people who have built this application. And as I said, I want to demo now that functionality. So really, in my part of this session here, I primarily have only demonstrations. So every one of you, if you want right now, you can go to openntf.org/xsnippets, and then you will see this homepage of the xsnippets application. So I won't go through all of the functionality here, but really focus on the social features. But essentially, the homepage has this navigator in the left where you can choose your different views, and then there are these columns, these two columns here in the main area of the window where you see the most recently added snippets and the most popular snippets. So let's just open one of these snippets, and I'm going to walk you through the different pieces of information and functions that you have right here. So first of all, the design has been kept simple on purpose. A snippet has only basically a subject and then the actual source code, and then some meta information and ways to share the link to the snippet. So let's start here at the top. So at the very top there's the name, and then there's the actual snippet. So what people can do now is to copy and paste only the parts that they are interested in, or if they want everything or for longer snippets, they can simply click this button here, select an X snippet to copy to clipboard. And now I need to move something here. I need to open a Firebug because I want to show you something. When I actually do a copy into clipboard, there's something interesting going on, which is an asynchronous call to the Domino, to the OpenNTF server. And in this case, we create a document in the xsnippets application to track how many times a specific snippet has been downloaded. Not downloaded, but copied in this case. And that's important for us, for one reason, because we want to know whether that whole application is used. And the other reason is we want to know which are the most popular snippets. So right here, we track the number of downloads, 164 times. Has this specific snippet been downloaded, and then you can also go into the view by popularity, and here we list the snippets by their download numbers in the last 3 months. Right, so that's how we calculate the popularity. Now going back here to the X-agent snippet, there's some more information in here, like the description, the language type, which can be XPages, JavaScript, XML, etc. And then there is a link about the author. We want to make sure authors get visibility and credibility they deserve. So they can define here links to their profiles. In this case, Stefan has only created one link to his OpenNTF profile, but you could also add links to other profiles, to home pages, to blogs, to Facebook profiles, and what have you. Another nice set of functionality is here this rating control. Now, as you can see here, this particular snippet has been rated 10 times with an overall rating of 4.9. Now, the interesting thing here is that this rating can be done anonymously. So, in social applications, and especially here in this community, we need to make it as simple as possible for people to consume code and other assets that we provide on OpenNTF, and we need to make it as easy as possible for them to provide feedback. So that's why we didn't want to enforce authentication, because many times people have forgotten their passwords and don't want to spend the time to find it, and so they rather don't rate or don't contribute any feedback. And again, in order to make that really easy, we have this anonymous rating. And by the way, we also allow anonymous downloads of all projects, which was different a couple of years ago, but again, we want to make it really easy. So another set of functionality is about embedding snippets and updates of this application, because what we are trying to do here is to collect all these valuable snippets in one central place on OpenNTF. But at the same time, we know that most of the contributors want to get traffic on their own blogs or on their own websites, right? So in many cases, they just publish snippets in their blogs, in which cases they are harder to find and also often not really under any license or a good license. So we want to encourage people to use the social application to put everything in a central place, and at the same time refer to these assets in their own blogs. So what you can do here is simply say embed, then you copy and paste here this HTML fragment and put it in your own blog, which is what I've done here. So this is my personal blog with my text, and then I use this iframe here to render the XSnippet here in line. And by the way, if or when consumers now do the copy to clipboard, we still track the download numbers. So that's one way to embed. That's a way to embed a snippet. Now there's another way for people to get updates of this application. When you go here on Follow XSnippets, there's actually another widget right here, which shows you the most recently added snippets and snippets by a certain author, snippets of a certain type. And I've opened that same widget, where is it? Right here. And what I want to do is I want to show you the source code, because technically it's quite interesting. In this case, we are not using an iframe, but instead we display this content in line, which is pretty lightweight and fast. And the reason that works, and the reason it works cross-domain, is because we use a technology called REST-JSON-P. And if you're interested in finding out how to implement that for your own site, go and download this application and take a look. Again, this is a good example for a code asset that you can easily reuse for your own applications, and it doesn't have to be developer-focused. A developer-focused application. Okay, I have to go a little bit faster and skip a couple of things here. I wanted to show you some other features. Where am I? So let's take this standby dialog custom control. And let me scroll down here to the bottom, because there's some more important information in here. Now, I admit that we could improve the UI design a little bit here, because it's kind of a long list of information, but the information that is displayed is quite valuable. The problem with social applications that I've seen a lot and still do is that information is scattered more than ever. It's not only in the one social application, but it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's in your own blog, it's in whatever other website, etc. So what we are trying to do here is to pull back all the information related to a specific XSnippet. And a good example here are related Twitter tweets. What I've seen personally through my community work in the last 3 years is that we get relative few comments in our blog, but we get at least 10 or maybe even 20 times more comments on Twitter. So the idea here is to federate this information back in the context where it belongs, which is in this particular XSnippet, and these are the tweets that you see right here. Another thing that I see often is that people comment about a website, a blog, or whatever on Facebook. And that's why we have here integrated the Facebook plugin that Tony demonstrated briefly earlier, so that you can also create comments directly here from the snippet, and they show up in Facebook as well. So those are a couple of examples for social capabilities, and now maybe the most important one or most interesting one, two functions are how to share information about the snippet on both IBM Connections and in our IBM Social Business Toolkit. So these share buttons here are pretty common on websites, and this is actually only a control that we use from, it's some public service, and I forgot which one, but there are many of them that exist that you can simply embed into your own web page. What we have extended here, though, is the capability to add also a link to the snippet to IBM Connections. So now when I press on this icon here, I can define my username and password, and this is the same functionality that Dan demonstrated earlier. Oh, this is too long. What did I do? And then I can log in. No. Okay, I need to copy my password, and you all have to forget it now, or I have to change it later. So let me try it again. And then I log in. And now I'm logging in to the Connections instance deployed on Greenhouse. Just a second. So it worked. The reason why I know that it worked is it shows my picture from Greenhouse. And now I can do two things. I can update my status, and I can also add a bookmark to one of my communities. So here I can choose between one of my communities and say publish bookmark. And something's going on, which you see here. There's a busy indicator, and the user experience right here is actually rather weak. I really should make that clearer that something is going on and that something has finished. But now when I go to my bookmarks here in the community and do a refresh, you will see this new a link right here to my standby dialog custom control. And similarly, I can also send a status update directly here from my application, from XSnippets, and it has been done. And I go to my profile page in Connections, and then I will see right here my status update, cool snippet, the standby dialog custom control, and here as well. So that's as easy it is to connect to Connections from an XPage application. And just real quick to show you how that has been implemented, I go back to the slides here, and I think I can do that rather fast because Dan has covered most of that already. So there's a couple of things. First of all, you need to define in your faces /config.xml -config.xml a link or a managed bean that is called Connections that points to the Connections instance that you want to access. And what you see here at the bottom is the custom login page. Okay, once you have done that, you can then write, in this case, Java code. You could also write JavaScript code, server-side JavaScript code, but in this case, I'm using Java. And what this code does is it reads the URL of my picture in Connections. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I need to do. First of all, I get here the endpoint, which is the name of my managed bean, Connections. Then I define here the URL of the REST API, /profiles, and so forth. Then I can pass in input parameters. And then really the key method here is this called service, which is a method of this generic, or it's a variable pointing to generic service. And then there's the method get, and there are also other methods, for post, delete, and so forth. And here I can pass in my input parameters, and I can define that I expect XML as output, because Connections has an XML or Atom-based REST API. And what you see here then below is what Dan talked about. It's a convenience API to pass the XML. It's that navigator, and then I can go through the elements that I need, and I read the URL. And that's it. That's really as easy as it is to to get the URL of my picture. Then another quick example is the scenario where I created a bookmark in a connections community. So again, first of all, I need to get the connections managed bean, and then I need to pass in again input parameters or an input entry document. It's called a community bookmark entry document. Now in this case, I use basically a brute force method here. I just create a string with the XML. You could also use the DOM APIs, etc., but I just use a string, and I pass in my parameters, the title and the bookmark. And then I call again on the generic service method .post, and I pass in my input parameters, my bookmark entry document, and that's it. Again, very easy and straightforward. And then just the last quick example. Let me go back to my XSnippet. So I pick the X agent again, and very similar functionality we also have for the Social Business Toolkit, and this is something that Tony already talked about. So I just do this real quick. I create an entry in the activity stream, and in order to show you that it worked, I go back to my, here it is, to my to the sample UI of the activity stream that is currently available on the Greenhouse. Now I have to warn you, the version that is on Greenhouse right now is a little bit older. It certainly does not match what we currently use internally for development of our next products, and we would like to update it soon, but at least there's a test version that gives you some ideas about where we're heading. There's also a couple of things that don't work perfectly right now, but again, these will change. We're just trying to give you some ideas about where we're trying to, or what we're trying to do in our next products rather soon. So here you can see now the entry that I just created, the entry to my X agent. And now the interesting thing that we haven't talked about so far is when I click on this one here, you can actually see the XSnippet X agent showing up right here in line. And that's an interesting technique. It's certainly something that you've heard about us talking about at Lotusphere. It's called an open social gadget, and it's kind of similar to what we have already in XPages with iWidget support. So that's why it was quite easy to wrap up an existing X page as a social gadget, and that's exactly what you see here. And essentially an open social gadget is just some XML pointing to an X page in an iframe, and again, this is what you see here. And you can also invoke some standard functionality that you might want to do directly from here without having to leave your context of the embedded experience. And then just real quick to show you the code behind that. So that's not the code, those are screenshots. Okay, so as Dan talked about, you have to define the tokens, your consumer key, consumer secret, as well as the endpoints, the URLs of your service, of the service that you're trying to access via OAuth in this web security store. This is what I've done here. Then in the next step, again, in the faces config XML, you define a managed bean. In this case, it's called Greenhouse, and it's pointing to greenhouse.lotus.com. And once you have done that, you can again either write Java code or directly use JavaScript. And this is what you see here. It's code or server-side JavaScript directly in your X page. So I don't want to go through all of the details here, but the important part is that there is an API, sbt.activity_stream_service. You pass in the name of your managed bean, Greenhouse, and you pass in the URL of the REST API that you want to invoke. And then again, you can do you can invoke post, get, delete. In this case, we do a post. and that's it. And then we pass in that we want to receive JSON as output data, because the Social Business Toolkit actually supports both JSON and element. You can define in this API call what output you want to get. And that's it. And in the input, how's it called, document or message here in these set of input parameters, I define here a link to my Open Social gadget. And it's just another XSP, and the gadget is represented here in this XML. And if you want to take a closer look at that sample, just go to OpenNTF, download XSnippets, and try it yourself. Just real quick, before I wrap it up, I created another blog entry the other day because many people have asked me for how I've implemented this page here on XPages info. This page displays entries from Stack Overflow, questions that have been tagged with XPages. And we just list all of these questions here with links to these questions, and also at the bottom we display here the top contributors who have asked or answered most of these questions. Now, the implementation is actually pretty straightforward and easy with the social enabler. Let me open it again in full screen mode. Here's it. It's basically, or the snippet has basically two parts. It's the faces config here again. You define a managed bean called Stack Overflow, and the interesting or important thing to note here is that you don't need the web security store in this example, because Stack Overflow does not use OAuth, so it's easier to access it, and then you just can pass in here the key as an input parameter. Alternatively, you can also store it in the Web Security Store, as we have done it for Facebook. But in this sample, I tried to come up with a solution without the Web Security Store, because some people didn't want to deploy an extra database to do that. Now, the interesting thing here is that there is this new data source called REST JSON data, and you pass in here the endpoint, Stack Overflow, and once you have defined this data source, you can bind it to your repeat control, to your view control, etc., in the same way as you do it for domino views. Very easy and straightforward. And then you just refer to these entries in the JSON output via JavaScript, entry.owner.displayName. Very easy, very straightforward. Now, another interesting feature that we haven't mentioned here is an ability that comes out of the box with these data sources, and that is caching. When I implemented this feature first, Stack Overflow complained that we did too many requests. So I had to find a way to ask Stack Overflow only every other minute for updates. And I asked just Phil Vian, whether we could extend that, and he only told me that it's already in there. And this is a nice function here. You can simply define a timeout and can use caching, and then XPages only does these actual REST requests every 3 minutes, and in the meantime it returns them to data from the cache. So very nice feature that I just wanted to mention here. Okay, so just to sum it up, everything that you have seen today is available today, so that's the good news. It's not in our product yet, it's not in an upgrade pack yet, but it is available on OpenNTF, and it has been since, I think, October last year. And also, what I mentioned in the chat here, there is a new book about the extension library, and there will be one chapter about the social enabler in it that I encourage you to check out. In terms of functionality, I think the social enabler is very, very powerful. I tried myself a year ago before the social enabler to use OAuth. And as Dan said earlier, don't try it yourself. I mean, everything is possible, but it's very hard. You have to pick the right OAuth library, and there's different behaviors between the different services, and most importantly, managing the credentials is really hard. You don't want to do it in your source code. You don't want to create your own web security credential store. And all that infrastructure is available here as part of the social enabler, so that you can very easily invoke these REST APIs using OAuth, JSON, Atom, etc. And that brings up a whole lot of possibilities, to access connections, Lotus Live, Same Time, Dropbox, Twitter, LinkedIn, what have you. So very powerful set of functionality, and you can invoke these REST APIs and you can do whatever you want, or you can use that set of convenience functionality that we provide, which are one, the data sources, especially for connections, Twitter, Dropbox, but also the UI controls that you have seen, the controls that allow you to embed Same Time and connections profiles, etc. So that's a quick summary, and that's everything that I wanted to cover today, and I hope that we have some more time for questions.
Thank you,
Okay,
Nicholas.
thanks, Nicholas.
Go ahead, Howard.
Okay, we're just going to kick off the Q&A. And before we do that, now that we've kind of got an introduction to the social controls, let's take a quick poll. And so we got a poll going on right now. If you can let us know what your thoughts are on using the social controls. While you're doing that, when you want to ask a question, here's the way it's going to work. In your GoToWebinar interface, there's a questions pane, and you can ask the question there. From this point on, we will respond to the questions verbally. In other words, Paul and I will ask your questions of our panelists, and they will respond verbally. So we won't really be responding to the questions in the questions pane. We did respond to some of those. Also on the screen right now, after you do your poll, we do have contact information for both TLCC and GBS, as well as the Twitter IDs for our panelists and for GBS and TLCC. Okay, so let's go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And so a vast majority of you do plan on using, not a majority, but about 42% are planning on using the social controls in the next 6 months, and just about the rest of you are planning on using it within the next year. So that's interesting, the interest in the social controls. Okay, so Paul, are you ready with the first question? Before you do that, let me have Dan do a question that did come up in the question several times. But Dan, can you explain the extension library and the upgrade pack 1? Is there any way to get those to coexist together? Several people were asking about coexistence. I guess they want to use some of these new features, but also want to use the upgrade pack 1 because of the ability to get support from IBM.
Unfortunately, there's no supported way of doing that. You either have to have one or the other, unfortunately. But like that, so the extension library basically is the upgrade pack plus, relational and the social controls. So if you can reproduce a particular issue in the upgrade pack, then you will get support for it, even though you are using the extension library. So I guess that's the, if it's an entire organization, if they need to roll out some feature that's in the extension library, they can certainly roll it out, and if they encounter an issue and that issue is reproducible in the upgrade pack, then we will certainly field it.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Dan, while you're on, I have a question for you, and a reminder to the participants, if you have a question that you want to direct it to someone specifically, write that into your question. So this is for you, Dan. What is the ETA for the next upgrade pack or the next release of Domino that's going to have these social controls in it?
So there is no ETA at the moment. It'll be an upgrade. It will be delivered as an upgrade pack to 8.5.4. So there was some talks about delivering this as an upgrade pack to 853, but we've since reprioritized some features for 854, so we've determined that those features for 854 are more important. So we're currently working on 854, but definitely there are plans in the making to deliver this, as an upgrade pack to 854.
Okay, and I knew that was a fair question, but there you go. Howard, do you have one? I've got one here as well.
Here's a quick one, and just to verify, I believe that everyone was demoing on 853 and not on 854 or even an earlier version. That was a question by Fernando.
That's right. The demos as shown will work on 853.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, I was demoing using 854, and what is available today works on 854.
On 854 and 853, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Andrew. Do you now consider Dropbox to be security safe? And that's an open question. Anyone want that?
Well, I guess, we haven't done any Nicholas can certainly chime in, but we haven't done any specific security testing around it, so we can't really comment on how safe it is. It's just we've provided APIs to access it. It's up to the individual users, I guess, to determine if it's safe enough for them.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, because it's not really about the social enabler, it's about Dropbox functionality. We use OAuth, we do everything we can. How secure Dropbox is another topic.
Okay, thanks. What about, we have a question from Patrick. What about LinkedIn? We were interested in working with LinkedIn in our social notes applications.
Dan, do you want to take that? Because we discussed it last week only.
I'm sorry, I actually missed the question. Someone had pinged me at the same time about something. So is it how about using LinkedIn?
Support for LinkedIn, yes.
Yes, yeah. So absolutely, we had. I had looked into it previously, and it is certainly possible to use LinkedIn. Just it's actually not that difficult. It's very similar to how you would use, for instance, if people are interested in doing it themselves, if they would take a look at how the Twitter data source is implemented, it would be very similar to that. There are just some licensing concerns that we have about, adding that to OpenNTF. So we decided rather than trying to jump through those hoops, we just put our focus elsewhere. But certainly, if individuals, if there's strong demand for that, get back to us. But if it's a case that a certain company needs to do it, it is not that difficult to do. Just take a look at the Twitter data source.
Right, because as we discovered, there's 3 lines of code or something, right, that we have to add to enable LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can deliver that in an update to the extension library soon. But then, as you said, as Dan just said, there's another legal issue that makes it very hard, or maybe even impossible, for us to open source that. But you can just go ahead and use that functionality, without us having to provide a sample.
Okay, I have a question from Maxon, and this is addressed to Tony. How do we get the list of data sources which we saw in your presentation?
Okay, so if you open up an X page or a custom control and go to the data palette, there's a data property sheet just on the bottom of the middle of the screen, and then from that you can select to add the data sources. When you click on add, you will see a number of different data sources exposed at that level.
So I think the question he's probably asking is how do they appear, as opposed to just seeing Domino View and Domino Document, how do all those other ones appear, and isn't that just come once you install the extension library?
Yes, that is correct. Once you have installed the extension library in your client, those data sources will be exposed in that pop-up menu.
Okay, thank you.
There's one caveat there that you need within application properties, you need to also add a dependency on the library in which the data sources appear. So they don't just appear automatically like the controls do in the palette. But if you add any of the extension library controls to your XPage, then automatically the application becomes dependent on the extension library, and at that point the data panels will start showing all of the data sources available.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Leon regarding Facebook. Can you interact with the Facebook chat function?
Sorry, with what function?
The chatting capability in Facebook.
Chatting. I don't know. It depends on what the API provides. The Facebook controls that come with the extension library with the social enabler basically only embed the or pull in the Facebook JavaScript API. So these APIs are APIs that, or are client-based APIs that call directly to Facebook and don't go through the Domino server. And you know, the answer to that question is really whether the Facebook JavaScript APIs support that or not. And I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Something that can be found out. The other alternative might be not to use the Facebook controls that come with the social enabler, which are, as I said, the JavaScript APIs, but in fact to use the REST APIs from Facebook and go through the Domino server, because from reading the Facebook sites it sounds like their REST APIs are always the most sophisticated and advanced APIs. And new functionality is available there first, and then they provide the convenience APIs like JavaScript and PHP only on top of that. So if the JavaScript APIs don't support that, maybe it's worth checking out whether the Facebook REST API is supported.
Okay, there were a number of questions related to documentation. How do we get documentation on the extension library? There was some discussion about the new extension library book, and Paul Hannon actually posted that that's going to be available next week. But anyone else want to comment in on documentation and getting help for these advanced functions?
Yeah, there's also a cheat sheet available that David Leedy produced for LotusSphere, and I think it's available on one of his websites, I think cheatsheet.com or something. And it's only a 4 pages flyer that shows you how to get started very quickly, because as Tony said, it's essentially as easy as copying 2 databases to your data directory. But then there is some configuration that you need to do to set up the credentials, and that's exactly what is described in the cheat sheet. So where do you get the credentials and where do you put them?
Okay, thanks, Nicholas. There was another question from Leon. When you're working with Dropbox, does the file go to the server first or directly to the user's PC via the browser?
So the file actually gets uploaded to the Domino server, and then from there it's only stored temporarily on the Domino server, and then via REST APIs from the Domino server it's sent to the Dropbox site, to the Dropbox service, and then once it is sent, it is no longer on the Domino server. So then obviously then you can view it on your, through the Dropbox application, which is actually just connecting to the Dropbox service. So these files are not stored on your Domino server, they're only just temporarily stored there for the purposes of upload.
All right, thanks. And by the way, the Pete Jensen has posted the URL for the social cheat sheet, which is one of the questions there. And I'll, if you can't, let's see, I don't know if you can cut and paste that out to your browser, but that is there. Paul, you have another question?
Yes, I've got a question from Rohit, but just before I ask that, it is a little bit over time here, so we'll be wrapping it up in a couple of minutes, I think, Howard. Maybe one or two more questions. So we have a question from Rohit. The modal dialog box that appeared in a couple of the demonstrations, where did that come from? Is that an extension library control? Is that a Dojo thing?
Tony, do you want to take that one? Or?
Yes, that is an extension library control. It's a drag and drop control. You can pretty much drag and drop it onto your X page and configure the content within that. When you do go to load that dialog, it will lazy load the content. So it is a very powerful and efficient control.
Okay, thanks.
Good. I'll tell you what, let's finish up with this one comment and question by Andrew. And so I think Andrew liked what he saw, but he wants to know, how can he convince my admin to buy into social controls and stop panicking about security with XPages?
So is that question related to the question or to the potential issue that you need to install the extension library from OpenNTF?
I would think so, Nicholas. Yeah, I think it's a combination of having to install it on the server, and then also I think when you're dealing, I think the perception is, oh, Facebook, Twitter, you know, that's on my server, you know, is that causing a problem to the rest of the data, because now we're interacting with these social sites which have, you know, a little bit of a reputation when it comes to security in a lot of people's minds.
Okay, so it sounds like there are two concerns.
Parts,
one is one is the installation of the extension library, and the other part is, you know, are there any security concerns in general when I access any other social services, external ones? So to start with the last one, so you know, the social enabler, you know, gives you the technology to access these other services. What that means for you in terms of security, legal things, etc., is really up to you. You know, we give you the technology, but that doesn't mean necessarily that, well, that does not mean that we, you know, are responsible, we as IBM, for all these social services, security, or potential security concerns, etc. So really the recommendation is to assess one by one whether and which services you want to access. Technically, we don't store any information on the server other than maybe temporarily for the file updates. But other than that, the data sources and the REST APIs are not using any data sync, right? So the data is not really on the Domino server unless you store it explicitly in a notes document or wherever else on the Domino server, right? So I think some people might have been confused in the past when they saw these demos, because these views, they just look and feel like Domino views. And in fact, as we've shown, you can use the same repeat and view controls as for Domino views. But that does not mean that any of the data is in the notes database. We pull it directly, we read it immediately directly from these services. Okay. So then the other concern, the first concern, was about deployment of the extension library from OpenNTF. And yes, it's true that that library is not officially supported from IBM. But as Dan said earlier, if you have a problem with that version, try to reproduce it in the upgrade pack 1, which is essentially the extension library minus these extended plugins from, when was it, 2 or 3 months ago. And if you can reproduce that, we will take a look. So that's the official support statement. But then unofficially, what I've seen personally is that many people ask questions, report defects, create feature requests, etc. on OpenNTF, and the response the responsiveness is pretty good. I mean, everyone from our team is really looking into these defects and then trying to understand them, trying to fix them. That doesn't mean that you will get official IBM support, but in reality, I think you get pretty good feedback from the XPages developers who work on that project, because all of them are pretty excited to work on this new technology, and all of them love to get the feedback from customers who are actually trying to use it, and we're trying to help as much as we can.
Right. Oh, thanks, Nicholas. And let me add too, Nicholas, that if you use the extension library versus the upgrade pack, you can use the catalog to install it on the server, and then you only have a one-line change in your notes.ini file versus having to actually copy files to the physical server. So in some ways, the extension library might be a little more acceptable to your admins than the actual upgrade pack because of the use of the catalog to install it.
Yeah,
okay.
That certainly makes it much easier.
I think we're basically out of time and over time, but I'd like to thank everyone who stuck around.
And that concludes this edition of Group Talk. Thanks for watching. To engage in conversations with us, visit twitter.com/gbsknows. To stay up to date, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/joingbs. And to watch entertaining and informative videos, visit youtube.com/gbsknows. And don't forget, visit our website and send us an email at gbs.com and info@gbs.com. Thanks again.